Hello, high school football fans. This is Ian from the Steelers and At. With 2 weeks left in the WPIAL season, I've put together a rundown of all the playoff scenarios in each of the 4 classifications. Before we get started, I'll give a brief overview on how the standings are determined. The first thing that's most important to remember is that only conference games count. So conference record is the first thing that goes into determining the standings. Second, if there's a tie, is head-to-head competition. Third is Gardner points, which I'll get into in a minute. And fourth is the WPIAL point differential system. And then fifth is a coin flip, which in the time I've been following high school football, I've never seen it come down to a coin flip. Tiebreakers always revert back to head-to-head whenever possible. The Gardner points system. There's a lot of people that are confused by this and don't like it, but that's also because the WPIAL includes some extraneous things in their calculation. So to start, only section games are used. Teams are supposedly awarded 100 points for each section win, and I'll tell you in a minute why that rule is stupid. Third, the winning team gets 10 points for each of the defeated team's victories. So if Team A beats Team B and Team B has a 3-3 section record, then Team A gets 30 points towards the Gardner point system, and it's cumulative to whatever point in the season you are. So if we remember, when we look at the standings, that the tiebreakers revert to head-to-head whenever possible. So Gardner points only come in whenever teams are tied head-to-head, which means they have the same record. Therefore, we don't need the 100 points for each section win because the teams in question with the Gardner point system already have the same number of section wins. So that part of the calculation is superfluous to figuring out the actual numbers. If you're looking at, if in the example here, if Team A has 4 section wins, having 430 Gardner points is the same as having 30 Gardner points if they're tied with someone else with 4 section wins. The WPIAL point differential system, in this one, it's like a basic point differential where, if you win, you get positive points. If you lose, you get negative points. The only caveat here is that you get a maximum or minimum of 10 points in the positive or the negative if you win or lose a game. Let's look at a real-life example. The North Hills Indians, they're right now 3-2 in the Northern 8 Conference, 4-3 overall, which doesn't matter as much as their conference record matters. We see that they've amassed 20 Gardner points by beating Butler and Fox Chapel, both of whom have 1 win, and they've lost games to Central Catholic and Seneca Valley in the conference. Their out-of-conference games don't count towards Gardner points or the WPIAL points, and their WPIAL points, they're at a +7 right now based on the cumulative effect of all their wins and losses. Moving on to Quad A, the biggest of the classifications, we will start in the Foothills Conference, where McKeesport and Gateway have secured home games in the first round. Hempfield, Kiski, and Penn Trafford have all locked up playoff berths. In Quad A, there are 3 conferences. The top 5 from each conference make the playoffs, and then there's a 16th seed wildcard team that's the best of the 6th place finishers, which with 2 weeks left in the regular season, there's too many variables to figure that out right now, so I'm not even going to get into it. In the Foothills Conference, we have a battle for 3rd place, which 2 of the 3 third place teams get home games in the first round, so whoever comes out in 3rd place will have a shot to get a home game, which is important because playing in front of your home fans makes a big difference. When we look at the breakdown of the 3 teams that are battling for 3rd place, Hempfield, Kiski, and Penn Trafford, Hempfield has a win over Kiski, Kiski has a win over Penn Trafford, and Penn Trafford and Hempfield play in the last week of the season. In a three-way tie scenario, Hempfield would probably have the advantage based on their WPIAL points as they stand right now. Penn Trafford certainly has the hardest road to go, playing Gateway and Hempfield. Kiski plays McKeesport, who, like Gateway, is undefeated and at the top of the conference. This conference title is going to be decided in the last week of the season when McKeesport and Gateway face off. Moving on to the Northern 8 Conference, Central Catholic has already locked up the championship here, and Seneca Valley has clinched a home game, and North Hills, North Allegheny, and Pine Richland have all secured spots in the playoffs. North Hills actually has games against Pine Richland and North Allegheny to close out the season, so the battle for third place here is also wide open. And North Allegheny already has a win over Pine Richland, which means that Pine Richland's only hope of coming in third place is to beat North Hills and then have North Hills beat North Allegheny next week, which would result in a three-way tie for third place. If North Hills beats Pine Richland this week, then the winner of the North Allegheny-North Hills rivalry game will finish in third. Due to their non-conference splits, whoever finishes in third in the Northern 8 probably won't get a home game in the first round of the playoffs. Moving on to the Southeastern Conference, Upper St. Clair, Woodland Hills, and Bethel Park have already clinched playoff berths, and Upper St. Clair has secured a first-round home game. Upper St. Clair can clinch the conference championship with a win over last place Plum this week, so that seems like a pretty likely scenario. Penn Hills can clinch a playoff berth with a win over Mount Lebanon. Peters Township can clinch a playoff berth with a win over Woodland Hills, which seems a little less likely than Penn Hills beating Mount Lebanon, who's sitting at 2-4 in the conference right now. There are two playoff spots still up for grabs in the Southeastern Conference, the fourth place spot and the fifth place spot. Penn Hills certainly has the advantage for the fourth place spot with their 4-2 conference record, and as I said, they can get in with a win over Mount Lebanon this week. Peters Township has wins over both Baldwin and Mount Lebanon, so they certainly have the edge for the fifth place spot. But Baldwin or Mount Lebanon could hop Peters Township if Peters Township loses out and Baldwin and Mount Lebanon were to win their remaining games. To briefly recap where Quad A is right now, we have one team that's clinched their conference championship in Central Catholic. We have four other teams that have clinched home games, with Gateway and McKeesport from the Foothills Conference that'll play in the last week of the season to determine their conference champion. Seneca Valley from the Northern 8 Conference, who can't win their conference because Central Catholic has already clinched it. And then Upper St. Clair from the Southeastern Conference, who has the inside track to winning that conference title. Bethel Park, Hempfield, Kiski, North Allegheny, North Hills, Penn Trafford, Pine Richland, and Woodland Hills have all clinched playoff spots as well. So that means that 13 of the 16 playoff spots in Quad A have been decided with 2 weeks left in the regular season. Moving on to AAA. In AAA, there's also 3 conferences with the top 5 in each conference automatically qualifying for the playoffs, and one wild card 6th place team becomes the 16th team in the playoffs. As with Quad A, I'm not even going to deal with the wild card because there's too many variables at this point with 2 games remaining in the season. In the Big 9 Conference, West Mifflin and Thomas Jefferson are both undefeated and are on the fast track to a showdown in the last week of the season once again for the conference title. Ringgold and Elizabeth Forward have also clinched playoff spots. Ringgold has clinched the 3rd place spot, but they've not yet secured a home game, and they can't do so this week because they play a non-conference game against Highlands, which is actually a very important game as far as playoff seeding is concerned, because Highlands is currently in a 3-way tie for first in the Greater Allegheny Conference, which we'll get to in a moment. Bell Vernon can clinch a playoff spot this week if they beat Laurel Highlands and both Uniontown and Albert Gallatin lose. Bell Vernon has a head-to-head win over Uniontown, which is enabling them to hold on to 5th place right now. However, it becomes a wide-open spot if Laurel Highlands is able to beat Bell Vernon. Moving on to the Greater Allegheny Conference, this conference is kind of a mess from top to bottom. At the top, there's a three-way tie for first between Highlands, Franklin Regional, and Mars, who have all beaten each other so far this year. Out of the top three, Highlands is the only one that has secured a top three finish. Mars and Franklin Regional can both secure top three finishes with wins over Hollidaysburg and Hampton, respectively, this week. In the race for the conference championship, if the top three teams all win out, Mars actually has the inside track because of the WPIAL points tiebreaker system. In this case, Highlands would finish second based on their head-to-head win over Franklin Regional because, as we remember, it reverts back to head-to-head whenever possible. The race at the bottom will become even more clear this week when Indiana and Knock face off. Indiana and Knock are currently tied for 6th place, and Indiana has a win over 5th place Hampton, while Knock has a win over 4th place Hollidaysburg. With Hollidaysburg facing Mars and Hampton facing Franklin Regional, the potential exists for a three-way tie for 4th, 5th, and 6th place heading into the last week of the season. Even if Hollidaysburg and or Hampton were to win this week, they could be surpassed by Knock or Indiana in the last week of the season. The interesting thing here is that there is a nightmare scenario which could take place, which would involve Hollidaysburg losing out to Mars and Indiana, Hampton losing out to Franklin Regional and Mars, Knock beating Indiana and then losing to Highlands, Indiana losing to Knock and then beating Hollidaysburg, and Greensburg-Salem beating Derry in their last conference game. If all of that happens, which is very possible, all 5 teams could finish at 3-5 in the conference with 2-2 records against each other. Moving on to the Parkway Conference, defending champion West Allegheny is 1 win away from securing the conference championship. If they beat Montour this week, the defending AAA champions will win the Parkway Conference this year. West Allegheny and Central Valley have both secured first-round home playoff games. Newcastle can clinch a third-place finish with a win over Moon and a Montour loss this week. At the bottom, Hopewell has had a season to forget unless you consider their wide receivers starting a Twitter account as something to remember. But they're at 0-7 right now, and they face 0-7 Freedom from Class AA's Midwestern Conference, so the Vikings may be able to pull out their first win of the season this week. To recap AAA, no conference championships have been clinched yet, but Central Valley, Thomas Jefferson, West Allegheny, and West Mifflin, who are considered by pretty much everybody to be the top 4 teams in AAA, have all clinched home playoff games. The Big 9 conference title between Thomas Jefferson and West Mifflin will be decided in the final week of the season. West Allegheny can secure the Parkway Conference this week. Additionally, Elizabeth Forward, Franklin Regional, Highlands, Mars, Montour, Moon, Newcastle, and Ringgold have all secured playoff spots. This means that 12 of the 16 playoff spots in AAA have been decided, with 4 more to be decided over the last 2 weeks of the season. Moving on to Class AA, things start to make a lot more sense as far as the playoffs go in AA and Single A, where both classifications have 4 conferences, so the top 4 teams from each conference make the playoffs, and the top 2 teams in each conference get home playoff games in the first round. Starting off in the Allegheny Conference, 3 schools have already clinched playoff berths: Shadyside Academy and Katanning, who will play for the conference title in the last week of the season, along with Valley. Shadyside Academy and Katanning both can't get caught looking ahead, as they will face off for the conference championship next week, but if either loses this week, they could wind up playing on the road in the first round. Katanning faces Valley, and Shadyside Academy faces Summit Academy. If either team loses, a loss next week and a win by the team that beat them could catapult either Valley or Summit Academy into the top 2. Wins by both Summit Academy and Valley this week could create a 3-way tie scenario for second place. Summit Academy could clinch the first playoff berth in school history with a win over Shadyside Academy this week or a loss by Burrell. East Allegheny is currently in 5th place, but with a 3-4 conference record and only one conference game remaining, they can't make the playoffs due to a head-to-head loss to Summit Academy and a head-to-head loss to Valley, who both already have 4 conference wins. Burrell can actually catch Summit Academy due to their head-to-head victory, but they must win out by beating East Allegheny this week and Deer Lakes in the finale, and they need Summit Academy to lose both of their remaining games to Shadyside Academy and Freeport in order for Burrell to reach the playoffs. Moving on to the Century Conference, all 4 playoff berths are locked up here, with South Fayette, Quaker Valley, South Park, and Seton LaSalle already in the postseason. South Fayette can clinch the conference championship with a win over South Park this week. Quaker Valley can clinch their first home playoff game in school history with a win over Burgettstown and a loss by South Park. South Park still has a very outside shot at the conference title if they win out over South Fayette and Seton LaSalle, and they need a Quaker Valley loss to Burgettstown, who hasn't won in a few years. Quaker Valley still has a chance to win the conference title if South Fayette were to lose out to South Park and South Allegheny, but that also doesn't seem very likely given how South Fayette is playing right now. Moving on to the Interstate Conference, Mount Pleasant beat Washington last week to clinch the conference title. Both Mount Pleasant and Washington have playoff berths clinched, and Washington will also have a home playoff game. Jeannette can clinch a playoff berth with a win over Waynesburg and a loss by York this week. Greensburg Central Catholic clinches a playoff berth with a win over York. Things can get messy if Greensburg Central Catholic doesn't win this week. York will not clinch a playoff berth if they beat Greensburg Central Catholic because of the potential for a 3-way or 4-way tie scenario with York facing Southmoreland and Jeannette facing Greensburg Central Catholic in the final week. York would be eliminated with a loss to Greensburg Central Catholic. Waynesburg still has a glimmer of hope if they win out over Jeannette and rival Washington, and Greensburg Central Catholic were to win out, then Waynesburg could actually edge Jeannette for the final playoff spot. Southmoreland still has a chance, but it's a difficult road. They would need to win both of their remaining games against Charleroi and York by 10, and would need York to beat Greensburg Central Catholic by 5 or less, and then need Jeannette to beat Greensburg Central Catholic by 10. This would put Southmoreland into the playoffs based on the WPIAL points tiebreaker. They would have 0, York would have 0, and Greensburg Central Catholic would have a -4, and Southmoreland would have the head-to-head victory over York in the final week of the season, which would be an absolutely crazy scenario to happen. And since Jeannette and Greensburg Central Catholic play in the final week, one of those two teams will get to 5 wins and will get the 3rd playoff spot. However, either of them could still get jumped in any number of the tiebreaker scenarios if they were to lose this week. Finally, the Midwestern Conference, where Beaver Falls and Aliquippa have both clinched playoff spots and have clinched home games. They face off this week with the conference title on the line. Due to the fact that Mohawk, who's in 5th place, plays a non-conference game this week, New Brighton and Beaver cannot clinch playoff berths this week. The potential does exist for New Brighton, Beaver, and Mohawk all to end the season in a 3-way tie where 2 of them would make the playoffs. If New Brighton and Beaver were to win this week and then Beaver loses to Aliquippa and Mohawk beats New Brighton next week, we would see this scenario happening. Elwood City is still alive, but barely. They need to beat Beaver this week and then hope to win out in a 3-way tie scenario against Beaver and Mohawk, which would also require New Brighton beating Mohawk. To recap AA, only one of the 4 conferences have their champion already decided, and that's Mount Pleasant in the Interstate Conference. Beaver Falls and Washington have secured home playoff games, while Aliquippa, Katanning, Quaker Valley, Seton LaSalle, Shadyside Academy, South Fayette, South Park, and Valley have all clinched playoff spots. This means that 11 of the 16 spots in AA have been decided with 2 weeks remaining in the season. Moving down to Class A, Stowe Rocks, behind quarterback Lenny Williams, who just broke the WPIAL passing record this past week, have clinched a playoff spot and can clinch the conference championship this week with a win over Laurel. Neshannock plays a non-conference game, but they can clinch a home playoff game with a Laurel loss. Neshannock actually plays North Catholic, who has clinched the Eastern Conference title, so that'll be an important game as far as playoff seeding is concerned. A Laurel victory over Stowe Rocks could create a three-way tie scenario at the top of the conference. In the battle for fourth place, Western Beaver certainly has the easiest road and can clinch a playoff berth with a win this week over Shenango. Rochester, who's currently sitting at 2-4, is in danger of missing the playoffs for the first time since 1996. Rochester currently has the longest playoff streak in Class A and the fourth longest in the entire WPIAL. They would be eliminated from playoff contention with a loss to Our Lady of the Sacred Heart or if Western Beaver beats Shenango. Olsh and Union are still alive, but their playoff hopes rely on Western Beaver losing out to both Shenango and Southside Beaver, who are the bottom two teams in the conference. Union would need to beat Southside Beaver and Neshannock, and then Olsh would need to beat Rochester this week, and then just pray next week while they play a non-conference game that all the stars align and things would fall their way. In the Black Hills Conference, we have an interesting scenario where Clairton, Fort Cherry, and Monessen have all beaten each other and are currently sitting in a three-way tie for first place. Chartiers Houston can clinch a playoff berth with a win over Monessen and a Brentwood loss this week. Taking a closer look at the championship race in the Black Hills Conference, we have five-time single-A defending champions Clairton locked in a three-way tie scenario with Fort Cherry and Monessen, where Clairton beat Fort Cherry beat Monessen, and Monessen beat Clairton. Now, if all three of these schools were to win out and win their remaining games by at least 10 points, therefore getting the maximum amount of points in the WPIAL tiebreaker scenario, Clairton, the five-time defending Class A champions, would actually find themselves playing on the road in the first round because Fort Cherry would win out based on the WPIAL point differential, and then in the determination for second place, Monessen would win out based on their head-to-head victory over Clairton. So if you're a Bears fan out there, you need to hope that either Fort Cherry or Monessen does not win one of their remaining games by 10 points. Staying in the Black Hills Conference, there is a battle going on for fourth place and the last playoff spot. Chartiers Houston is currently in fourth place with a 4-2 record, but they face Monessen, who is 5-1, and Fort Cherry, who is 6-1, to close out the season. If the Bucks lose both games, they could be surpassed by Brentwood, who is currently 3-3, and closes out with Carlinton and California, both of whom are 2-4 in the conference. Brentwood would need to win just one of these games to make the playoffs because they hold the head-to-head tiebreaker over Chartiers Houston. California still has a very outside chance at making the playoffs if they're able to win the rest of their games and then win in a three-way tiebreaker scenario. In the Eastern Conference, everything is pretty much wrapped up with North Catholic having secured the conference championship. Avonworth, Apollo Ridge, and West Shamokin have all secured playoff spots, with West Shamokin earning their first trip to the playoffs in school history. Avonworth can clinch a home playoff game with a win over Wilkinsburg this week. In the Tri-County South, Beth Center has already clinched the conference title, and Carmichael's has clinched a playoff spot. There are three teams that are currently still in the running for the last two playoff spots. Fraser, who has a 5-2 record in the conference, Avella, who is looking for their first trip to the playoffs since 1976, and Mapletown, who currently sits at 3-3. Fraser plays a non-conference game this week, but they could clinch a playoff spot if Mapletown loses. Similarly, Avella can clinch a playoff spot if they manage to beat Beth Center or if Mapletown loses. If Mapleton manages to beat Jefferson Morgan this week, the potential exists for a three-way tie scenario after the last week of the season when Fraser plays Mapletown. To recap Class A, two of the conferences have already been decided, with Beth Center claiming the Tri-County South title and North Catholic claiming the Eastern Conference title. No other teams have clinched home playoff games, but Apollo Ridge, Avonworth, Carmichaels, Clairton, Fort Cherry, Laurel, Monessen, Neshannock, Stowe Rocks, and West Shamokin have all clinched playoff spots. This means that 12 of the 16 playoff spots in Class A have been decided, with 2 weeks remaining in the season. This concludes the first ever WPIAL playoff YouTube breakdown from the Steelers and At. Please check out my blog. Follow me on Twitter. It's thesteelersandat.blogspot.com or at thesteelersandat on Twitter. Feel free to chat with me about the Steelers or WPIAL football anytime. Thanks, guys. Have a good day, and good luck to all the teams in the last 2 weeks of the season.